How's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and today we're going to take a look at some major rule changes throughout NBA history. For convenience, I'll be going in chronological order, starting from the oldest ones to the more recent ones, just to avoid confusion. That's pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward, so anyway, without further ado, here are, in my opinion, the 10 biggest rule changes in NBA history. 1947, zone defense gets banned. Very early on in the NBA's existence, there were obviously a lot of problems with the game. For those who don't know what zone defense is, it's basically allowing defenders to stay in certain areas with very little one-on-one action. The NBA made this change because they felt like one-on-one defense was better for entertainment. The fans would be more excited to watch. Banning zone defense allowed more individual stars to shine while creating more rivalries as well. This was all great for the growth of the game, and for the next 50 years, zone defense remained banned. 1954, the 24-second shot clock. I'll just leave this photo here. This sums up why the 24-second shot clock was created. Usually, the situations would be like, if a team has a lead with only a few minutes left in the game, they would hold the ball as long as they could, completely running out the game clock. This would lead to final scores in the 40s or 50s. However, one day, the Fort Wayne Pistons and Minneapolis Lakers took this to a whole new level. Every time the Pistons got the lead, they would hold the ball for as long as possible until it got stolen. This led to a final score of 19-18. Obviously, this was not entertaining. They heard boos from the crowd the entire night, but it still took nearly 4 years after this game for the shot clock to be implemented. That's because many teams tried to resist the change since they felt like the shot clock would remove the strategy from the game. They argued that it would turn the game into a track meet with people running up and down the court constantly. Regardless, it was a great change, the most important one in NBA history. 1964, the lanes widened from 12 feet to 16 feet. The lane has widened before, mainly due to the dominance of George Mikan. But by 1964, the change from 12 feet to 16 feet would be permanent. Up until today, it's still 16 feet wide. Many give credit to Wilt Chamberlain for causing this. While we've seen big men dominate the paint before, Wilt took it to a whole new level. So how did widening the lane actually hurt Wilt? Well, when the lane was narrower, he could just catch the ball so close to the basket and score. He would score so fast that he would avoid the 3-second rule. But with a wider lane, he has to start posting up from further out, thus making it harder for him to get to the rim, and making him more susceptible to violating the 3-second rule. Wilt was basically the pioneer for a lot of changes for big men. A few years prior, if a player took a free throw, he was no longer able to jump past the line until the ball hit the rim. This rule was made because during free throws, Wilt would just throw it off the backboard and dunk it. 1976, the introduction of hand checking. In an effort to give defensive players an edge, the NBA allowed hand checking as long as the defender does not impede the offensive player's progress. Over the next couple decades, the hand checking rule would be the center of controversy because it was a very subjective rule. What does impeding an offensive player's progress mean? Some players and some teams were much more physical than others when it came to defense. Defenders would argue that they're just playing physical basketball, but other teams argued that they were committing fouls on every play. The Detroit Pistons of the 1980s were the biggest culprit, with many teams complaining that their, quote, physical style of play was the same as just hacking players and getting away with fouls. You know how nowadays people look back at the 80s and 90s and say how much more physical it was? It's a cliche, but it's also true. Big men dominated those eras and most perimeter guys were struggling to even get to the rim. That's what makes Michael Jordan so much more impressive. Nowadays, even role players could blow by someone for a layup because defenders can't touch them without a foul being called. 1977, moving the ball to midcourt after a timeout. This was a pretty basic rule change, but also very important. This change allowed more exciting end-of-game situations. Because teams can now advance the ball to midcourt after a timeout, they have a much better chance of scoring. It also allowed coaches to shine because now they can show off their ability to draw up out-of-bounds plays. Previously, teams had to rush up the court near the end of the game, scramble around, and had a hard time scoring because the defense would be prepared. Now, because of this rule, we see more sophisticated plays out of bounds, smarter defense, more game winners, and game-tying shots. This rule added more strategy and more complexity when the game is on the line, and that's great. 1979, the introduction of the three-point line. One of the few aspects the NBA implemented from the ABA was the three-point line, and since they got merged, they decided to try it out. In the beginning, teams rarely shot three-pointers and the growth of the shot was very slow. That was for two main reasons. The first was because everyone thought the three-pointer was just a gimmick, and that it wasn't meant to be taken seriously and just a fun thing for the fans to enjoy. The second reason was that, well, not many players were good at shooting them. Most of them grew up without a three-point line, so they never practiced it before. So even statistically, it wasn't efficient enough. Around the mid-90s, the NBA realized that scoring around the league has dropped significantly, so to combat this, they briefly shortened the three-point line for 3 seasons, from 1995 to 1997. This led to a temporary increase, but then it dropped back down again. In recent years, because kids and teenagers grew up with a three-point line, the amount of threes in the NBA went up exponentially, to the point where the majority of teams are taking over 1/3 of their shots from beyond the arc. Some teams, like the Rockets, shoot over half of their shots from three. Of course, this has led to some arguments from the other side of the spectrum. Nowadays, the scores are so high that it's making defense less valuable, and other parts of the game have become obsolete. Personally, I think the next major rule change will have something to do with threes. 1994, three-point fouls were now granted 3 free throws. At a glance, this rule might not seem like a big deal because honestly, how often do players actually draw fouls on a three-point shot? At the time this rule was implemented, very few players did. However, the issue is that it encourages players to try and draw more fouls. Back then, Reggie Miller was a phenomenal three-point shooter, the best of his era, but because he was so good, defenders had to play him tight. So he had the liberty to be more creative and find ways to draw fouls to shoot 3 free throws, like for example, kicking his leg out. This led to the Reggie Miller rule, which forbid shooters from drawing fouls by initiating the contact first. However, in recent years, players started to find loopholes around that rule. James Harden is the biggest culprit of this, as he's so crafty that he would make it look like the defender initiates the contact. From the eye test, I think there's been way more players jumping into defenders than ever before, just to get those sweet 3 free throws. Overall, this rule led to way more players looking to draw contact on the perimeter. I would not be opposed to changing it back and only allowing 2 free throws on every shooting foul. What do you guys think? 1997, the no charge area. This is a rule that tried to eliminate the arbitrary block or charge calls. Back then, it was hard to determine if there was a blocking foul or an offensive foul, but by adding the no charge area, it made it easier to call blocks or charges. So, for example, if an offensive player drives to the rim and the defender is inside the restricted half circle area, then it's a blocking foul if he got there in time. If he's outside of the circle, then it's a charge on the offensive player. That's basically the gist of it, and it definitely made things easier for the refs and the players to understand the foul calls. 2001, the illegal defense changes. 2001 saw a bunch of defensive changes. First, any type of illegal defense was removed. This means after 54 years, zone defense was finally allowed. Or at least it was now officially allowed, because before teams would try to get away with it occasionally. This changed a lot because star players had to adjust to playing against zones. Bad or mediocre teams who did not have a superstar now had a better chance to guard other superstars. If Kobe was roasting you one-on-one, you didn't have to send a double team every time. Now you could switch to zone and try to stop him with a team effort. Another thing that was added was a new defensive 3-second violation. Defenders cannot camp the paint for more than 3 seconds unless they're close to another offensive player. This opens the lane up for perimeter players to dominate. And it was the beginning of an era where guards and wing players would take over the NBA. And finally, number 1, 2004, hand checking was removed completely. Since it was implemented in 1976, there's been a slow but inevitable decline of hand checking. It slowly went away as less and less physicality was allowed. By 2004, it was completely gone. Players could no longer put their hands on someone's waist or chest to control how they move. This was the final rule that turned the NBA into a perimeter-dominated league. And judging from the NBA's explosion in popularity, I don't think it was a bad thing. While it's always cool to see an old-school, grinded-out team trying to play through their bigs, the more popular and better teams are the ones who adapted to the changing landscape. Removing hand-checking also provided more protection to shooters because you can't really touch them, so it played a role in the three-point explosion as well. Shooters just have way more space than they used to, so it's not as hard to get off a shot. Anyway, that's all folks. Since 2004, the majority of rule changes have been relatively minor. Things like replay changes, allowing teams to contest a call, and some flagrant foul changes to clean up the game. There was a shot clock change that made it so the clock would only reset to 14 seconds after an offensive board, which increased the pace of the game even further. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this video and which rules do you think will be changed in the future. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.